What if I told you that The Patriot, the Revolutionary War epic with Mel Gibson, has just as much Hollywood myth as it does history? Today we're breaking down what the movie got right, and more importantly, what it got very wrong. Let's give credit where credit is due. Some parts of The Patriot actually line up with real history. The setting is real. The movie takes place in South Carolina in the late 1770s and the early 1780s. And that's accurate. The Southern colonies were the last major front of the war, and the fighting there was brutal. And the militias are correct too. Mel Gibson's character, Benjamin Martin, uses guerrilla warfare, ambushes, hit and run raids, and melting back into the swamps. And that's spot on. Leaders like Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens fought in this exact way. In fact, Marion even earned the nickname the Swamp Fox for his hit-and-run tactics. And another thing that was pretty spot on was the British brutality. Now, they weren't Nazis, but the British and Loyalists did burn homes, seize crops, and execute suspected rebels. The war in the South was neighbor against neighbor, and it got very personal. But here's where Hollywood takes over. The most famous scene in the movie might be the infamous church burning. In the movie, Colonel Tavington locks civilians inside a church and sets it on fire. That never actually happened. There is no record of the British committing an atrocity like that in the American Revolution. That scene looks a lot more like World War II Nazi war crimes than anything from 1776. Now, Tavington himself is loosely based on Banastre Tarleton, the British cavalry officer. Tarleton was ruthless. At the Battle of Waxhaws in 1780, his men cut down surrendering patriots, which earned him the nickname Bloody Ban. But to be fair to him, he never torched churches full of civilians. Another huge inaccuracy was how the movie dealt with slavery. The movie shows Benjamin Martin's plantation as his black workers were all, quote, free employees. In reality, South Carolina in the 1770s was a slave society. Enslaved Africans made up the majority of the population, and Francis Marion, the real-life model for Martin, was a slave owner. By leaving that out, the film sanitizes history and presents a picture-perfect plantation that simply doesn't exist. And finally, the film does exaggerate the militia's role. Yes, militias were crucial, but the decisive victories in the Revolution came from the Continental Army regulars and from the French help. The movie barely mentions the Continental Army regulars, giving the impression that a few local farmers beat the entire British Empire on their own. And what about the main character? Who was Benjamin Martin supposed to be? He is not a real person. Instead, he is a composite of several South Carolina militia leaders. Francis Marion, or the Swamp Fox, who was a master of guerrilla warfare in the swamps. Thomas Sumter, who they called the Gamecock, who was an aggressive militia general. And Andrew Pickens, who they called the Wizard Owl, respected for his discipline and tactics. And the final battle scene of the movie, you can throw in a little Daniel Morgan, who was one of my favorite revolutionary figures. Dan Morgan led the brilliant victory at the Battle of the Cowpens, which is what the final battle of the movie is loosely based on. But Mel Gibson's character is heavily cleaned up. He's a family man, reluctant to fight at first, and haunted by a violent past. The real figures were slave owners, land speculators, and far more complicated. In the end, the Patriot does capture some of Revolutionary War guerrilla warfare, the swamps, the militias, the personal nature of the fighting. But the details, they were somewhat sanitized, exaggerated, and in some cases, completely invented from scratch. So enjoy the movie for the drama, or the beautiful story that it tells. It is one of my favorite Revolutionary War movies, but don't mistake it for a history lesson. The real Revolutionary War was messy, brutal, and complicated. And maybe even more interesting than the Hollywood version. And if you liked our little version of History versus Hollywood, give us a like and a follow. And tell us what movie we should do next down in the comments. And if you want to know the true history, Hollywood's probably not where you're going to find it.